Hello everyone, this is Mr. Seymour, and this is Chapter 12, the Bureaucracy, the second half of this week's lecture on the executive branch. It's not hard to understand why Americans have such a strong negative view of American bureaucracy when government agencies fail at basic tasks, as in the case of Flint, Michigan, where national, state, and local authorities failed to prevent lead contamination of the city's water supply. Flint residents, like Leanne Waters, pictured here, confronted city and state officials with samples of contaminated water taken from their homes. Is this negative view accurate? How can we trust government to act in our interests, given such failures? Bureaucrats at different levels make rules, they implement rules, and they re-implement rules. They're checked by oversight from Congress, courts, and other bureaucrats, such as special inspectors' offices and special administrative law courts. What do? They implement policies established by Congress or the President. Then they develop programs and policies to achieve goals of law. When laws are specific, bureaucrats have little discretion. More commonly, laws provide general guidelines and give bureaucrats more discretion in how to implement. It's interesting to note that when we think of the executive branch, we generally think of the president, the president's presidential political appointees, and policy staff, and perhaps the military. All of that is dwarfed in size by the civil service, which performs most of the duties of the federal government on a day-to-day basis. The makeup of the federal bureaucracy includes millions of permanent employees, which are civil servants, and thousands of short-term workers or political appointees of the president. Bureaucrats listen to congressional pressure. Congress can overturn statutes that give bureaucrats power, and Congress controls their budgets. Very few people participate in the notice and comment procedure. They neither notice nor comment. One exception to the overwhelming trend of people not paying attention is people whose job it is to pay attention. This means that there's a danger that regulators, or bureaucrats, will be captured by the industries that they regulate. One possibility is that they may think that they'll be able to leave the civil service for a better paying job in industry. Federal regulations affect all parts of everyday life. Think about federal regulations for car safety. Here's a fact. Over 30,000 people a year are killed in car accidents. That's 10 times the number of people who died in September 11th attacks every single year. Now think about imposing a new safety regulation. It will make cars more expensive. By definition, this hurts poor people the most. But on the other hand, a new mandatory safety feature might save lives. Is it worth it? This is called a cost-benefit analysis. This basic formula is applied innumerable times by bureaucrats and fundamentally affects the safety of the world we live in. When we mandate that we have more fuel-efficient cars, we recognize that one way to achieve those standards is to make cars lighter. But lighter cars are generally less safe than heavier cars. Is the loss of safety worth the increase in fuel economy in the form of less pollution? These are the types of calculations that bureaucrats make every day. So, with regard to regulations, they are government rules that give government control over individuals and corporations by restricting behaviors. They're developed by a notice and comment procedure, and they're very political in their nature. They influence most aspects of everyday life. Bureaucrats often have influence on the way government shapes regulations. Federal regulations influence many aspects of everyday life that would not seem likely to be affected by government action. The increase in the number of women's intercollegiate athletic teams is partly due to regulations that require equal funding for men and women's teams. Pictured here is the University of Connecticut's 2016 NCAA Women's Basketball Championship team. The origins of the phrase red tape go back to the English practice of binding documents and official papers with red tape. It's an extremely old phrase that apparently dates to the 16th century, but the exact origin is obscure. Today, the phrase red tape is heavily associated with what economists call deadweight loss. That's when it takes lots and lots of extra effort to comply with a procedure, but no one, neither the citizen nor the government, gains anything from it. The existence of red tape, also known as unnecessary rules, as part of standard operating procedure, is one of the reasons that the words bureaucracy and bureaucrat are commonly used in a pejorative way in everyday speech. Political scientists use it in a way more value-neutral, non-judgmental. So, in examining bureaucratic expertise and its consequences, we have to understand that bureaucrats are experts in their field, in general more so than members of Congress or the President. Experts help create a state capacity. Criticism of bureaucracies is that there's too much red tape and a complex standard operating procedure manual that basically puts things into boxes and doesn't allow us to change from the constraints given. Despite their political expertise, bureaucrats still make mistakes. When the Medicare program implemented the prescription drug benefit in 2006, information about the coverage was available on an easy-to-read website. But the agency soon learned that many seniors who needed the information did not know how to use a web browser. The principal agent game is an important part of understanding bureaucracy. It's somewhat related to the Juvenalian question, who guards the guardians? One example of principal agent involves waiters in a restaurant. The owner wants them to work as quickly, efficiently, and politely as possible, as well as knowledgeable. The waiters themselves have their own goals, which might include minimizing effort, getting a few text messages in while on shift, and so on. How can management ensure that the agents, the waiters, are acting the way that they want them to? They can tie part of their pay to tips and compel their agents to have similar goals. The problem of control comes to the principal agent game. An agent or group works for another, the principal. Agents have information that the principals don't. How to let agents maximize their expertise while still making sure they do what they should is the question that involves the principal agent game. Regulatory capture is when bureaucrats work to benefit a small group of individuals or corporations instead of the public. Many Americans believe bureaucracy is wasteful and inefficient. Note, however, that the magnitude of negative feelings varies over time. Consider the time frame presented on the graph. What happened during these years that might explain the changes in citizens' opinions about the government? Notice that from 1987 to 2015, the view of the federal bureaucracy has gone down. The trend line is down. This cartoon of a monument to President Andrew Jackson riding a pig decries his involvement in the spoils system, which allowed politicians to dole out government service jobs in return for political support. In return, we got what we call the civil service system, which awards jobs on merit. During the Progressive era, the 1883 Pendleton Act created civil service. It's a series of acts in the 1890s, 1900s, and 1910s also gave government more power, including the Sherman Antitrust Act, Pure Food and Drug Act, and the Meat Inspection Act. The New Deal is programs implemented during FDR's first two terms in 1932 to 1940, which vastly expanded governmental power. The Great Society was another expansion of the size of and power of government and capacity of federal government under the LBJ administration in the 1960s. This included creation of Medicare and Medicaid and the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts. More information on the Progressive Era is that the intellectual zenith of the period of the burgeoning bureaucracy was the Progressive Era of 1890 to 1918. This was the era that gave us the idea of a technocratic mindset, where policy could be based on well-trained experts, scientific assessment of what works, not people's opinions and prejudice. The Progressive Era policies and agencies included the Federal Reserve, income tax, and prohibition of alcohol. The Federal Reserve was thought to profit from its independence from democratic control in deciding the optimal money supply and interest rate. Supposedly, it had solved the inflation problem, the unemployment problem, and given us the Great Moderation. Under President George W. Bush, the federal bureaucracy continued to expand. Programs like No Child Left Behind increased the role of government in society. The executive branch includes 15 cabinet-level offices, as well as several independent agencies and commissions and government corporations, a lot of which we talked about in the last lesson. You have the Office of the President, the Vice President, and the Executive Office of the President. Then you have the departments: Department of Agriculture, Commerce, Defense, Education, State, Energy, Health and Human Services, Homeland Security, Housing and Urban Development, Interior, Justice, Labor, Transportation, Treasury, and Veterans Affairs. And then you have selected individual establishments and government corporations, such as the Central Intelligence Agency, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, the Environmental Protection Agency, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the Federal Communications Commission, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the Federal Election Commission, the Federal Reserve Commission, or the Federal Reserve System, the Federal Trade Commission, General Services Administration, National Aeronautics and Space Administration, the National Foundation of the Arts and Humanities, the National Labor Relations Board, the National Railroad Passenger Corporation called Amtrak, National Science Foundation, Occupational Safety and Health Review Commission, the Peace Corps, Securities and Exchange Commission, Selective Service System, Small Business Administration, Social Security Administration, the U.S. Agency for International Development, and the United States Postal Service. The Department of Agriculture is headed by the Secretary of Agriculture and the Deputy Secretary of Agriculture, and includes various assistant secretaries and undersecretaries for the specific areas such as natural resources and the environment, farm services and rural development, and food safety. For example, the Federal Reserve appointees get 14-year terms. They limit their oversight. An example of politically driven bureaucratic decision-making is the Iraq War. The Office of Special Plans uses raw intelligence data rather than expert interpretations of the data when making a case for war. When we're talking about rules, you have hiring and firing rules regarding bureaucrats that affect the amount of oversight to which the bureaucrats are subject. Bureaucratic structure is often politically driven, as in the case that we just discussed of the Federal Reserve. This is a listing of the total employees in the federal government in selected cabinet departments. The Department of Defense has civilian employees amounting to 732,000. That's just civilian employees. Veterans Affairs, 366,500 civilian employees. Homeland Security, 188,100 employees. Justice, 119,800. Treasury, 103,000. Agriculture, 90,500. Health and Human Services, 74,400. The Department of the Interior, 66,700. Department of Transportation, $56,200. Department of Commerce, $45,600. Department of State, $34,500. Department of Labor, $17,700. Department of Energy, $16,100. Housing and Urban Development, $8,400, and Department of Education, $4,500. One of the most intense conflicts in American political life is over the size of the federal government. Generally, Republicans say that the size of the federal bureaucracy should be reduced, while Democrats tend to favor increasing the size of government programs. However, the size of government has increased steadily over time. But has the size of the bureaucracy gotten out of control? What do the numbers say? So the black line is government spending as real dollars. The white line is government spending as a percentage of GDP. If you look at the percentage of government spending as a percentage of GDP, really government spending is not as out of control as one might think. It's still, however, considerably higher than it was in 2000. By a few percent. Think about public school teachers who are government employees and the requirement that they receive teacher certification. Even a person in a highly technical field like nuclear energy cannot simply go and teach high school calculus. This person must study education first. Critics say that this is unnecessary and eliminates qualified people from becoming teachers. Critics also say that it makes no sense to give teachers civil service protections or tenure if they're not successful educating kids, that we should fire them. Defenders say not just anyone can teach. The study of education adds real value. Furthermore, members of professions don't live in constant fear of getting fired. Most employees in bureaucracy have strong interests in public service. Civil service jobs are different than private sector jobs. The job level is tied to experience and education. Seniority helps determine promotions. After 3 years of satisfactory job performance, a civil service cannot be fired without cause, which helps remove politics from bureaucracy. We call that tenure. Now, this is an analysis of the types of federal workers, and you will find that the majority of federal workers are either in management, business, and financial jobs, which are these, or in professional related jobs, which are these. So bureaucratic workers tend to be experts in their fields, not just clerks. It's not completely clear which activities are allowed or prohibited by laws. For example, in spring 2007, Karl Rove, Deputy White House Chief and close political advisor of President George W. Bush, had given briefings to senior political appointees on Republican losses in the 2006 midterm election and plans for the 2008 campaign. During one briefing, the head of the General Service Administration asked how her agency could help elect Republican candidates in 2008. As a senior member of the White House staff, Rove was exempt from the Hatch Act's prohibitions, which say that you can't conduct political activity while conducting government activity. But the more junior White House staff involved in the briefings were probably not. So there are limits on political activities. The Hatch Act prohibits federal workers from engaging in organized political activities. Senior White House staffers are exempt from these restrictions, but daily civil service workers are not. However, they are prevented from using government resources for political purposes. Federal employees must be careful that their comments to the media comply with the Hatch Act restrictions. President Obama's Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Julian Castro, shown here at a Common Sense Media Awards in 2016, violated the Hatch Act when he spoke to the 2016 presidential campaign during an interview with journalist Katie Couric. One of the problems for a new administration is finding appropriate government jobs for loyal campaign workers and contributors. Agencies that often employ these individuals, despite their lack of qualifications, are known as turkey farms. These appointees generally serve without mishap, but the Bush administration's use of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, as a turkey farm was cited as one reason for the agency's inadequate response to Hurricane Katrina. To be honest, the head of FEMA was an expert in breeding horses, not in emergency management. Political appointees and senior executive services, there's about 7,000 political appointees. The ability to make political appointments helps the president exercise some control over the bureaucracy, but 7,000 compared to the hundreds of thousands or millions of the political civil service employees is nothing. It's a drop in the bucket. Bureaucratic drift doesn't necessarily have to be nefarious. Though it is still troubling from a political control perspective, drift is the action of experts who prioritize their views over those of Congress. It may be fictional parks and recreation characters like Ron Swanson refusing to do anything, or it may be the environmentalist working for the Environmental Protection Agency who goes beyond what he or she is ordered to do. Lawmakers must determine how to get the benefits of bureaucratic expertise without giving bureaucrats complete control over their own behavior. And they reduce or eliminate bureaucratic drift. To do that, you must limit the discretion by giving direct orders, and even if this limits their bureaucratic expertise, you must exercise control over civil service workers. Lawmakers can also limit who runs the agency. Can you see how politics creeps back into the equation? The Federal Election Commission's 6 commissioners. There are 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats. That's an example. Lawmakers can control bureaucratic decisions by setting policy goals, choosing where the agency is located within the government structure, and overseeing control of specific agencies. Here's a topic for our discussion. What's the better route for Congress to take in bureaucratic regulation? Police patrol oversight is costly, as it takes up valuable time and resources, but it stops problems before they start. Fire alarm oversight is cost-effective, but help only arrives after the problem has emerged. How could Congress work it if it were more inclined to practice police patrol oversight of every political agency, governmental agency? Now, there's a difference between police and fire alarm oversight. Police oversight is constant monitoring and oversight using committees and oversight procedures. Fire alarm oversight is responding to complaints about a bureaucratic agency after they've done something wrong. So oversight comes from Congress. And advance warning requires bureaucrats to disclose their proposed actions before they take effect. Now, with regard to correcting violations, you can do that through legislation, executive orders, but the most challenging way of correcting problems is when Congress and the President disagree. This is when agencies often have more discretion and there's no oversight because the executive branch and the legislative branch can't come to an agreement. Many government regulations work as intended. An increase in regulatory attention to environmental protection and cleanup of polluted sites has dramatically improved water quality nationwide, including that of the Hudson River in New York, shown here. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal programs greatly expanded the power of the federal government and the bureaucracy. As this cartoon shows, these changes were controversial, with some seeing them as moving too much power from Congress to the President and the bureaucracy. The Senate's power over the confirmation of senior agency officials is often used as a tool to shape agency policy and operations. Richard Corday, the first head of the Consumer Financial Protection Agency, was nominated after some senators objected to President Obama's first nominee, Elizabeth Warren, who was a Harvard law professor at the time. Now she's a senator. After news of an $800,000 General Service GSA conference at a Las Vegas resort came to light in 2012, Congress held hearings on the agency's practices. Here, Representative John Mica, representative of Florida, criticizes the apparent misuse of taxpayer money. Although the term bureaucracy may suggest workers sitting behind desks in offices, the agencies of the federal bureaucracy form a wide range of tasks. Following the explosion of the BP's Deepwater Horizon oil rig in 2010, the Coast Guard, a government agency, responded to try to put out the fire. The State Department's backlog of passport applications is a good example of how bureaucratic actions or inactions can affect lives and plans of ordinary Americans. The Environmental Protection Agency created the Flint Water Advisory Task Force to coordinate federal, state, and local efforts to fix and contaminate the contamination of Flint's water supply. Besides changing the implementation of existing regulations, the task force will also investigate the need for new regulations to prevent similar problems from developing in other cities. Now let's see how things work in theory. Bureaucracy and legislation. Congress passes legislation, the President signs the bill into law, and now the law has to be interpreted and implemented, which is the job of bureaucrats, who design appropriate regulations and procedures. The courts respond to challenges to the law, and they can provide guidelines for implementation. Citizens and interest groups provide information and proposals to bureaucrats, and they lobby for their preferred implementation of the legislation. Other bureaucrats disseminate regulations to state and local governments, corporations, and individuals, and they monitor compliance. Regulations can be revised in light of changing circumstances, different political climates, or unanticipated consequences. So let's look at regulating greenhouse gas emissions, the EPA. We have a new act. Congressional action is the Congress enacts two Clean Air Acts in 1963 and 1970, with amendments in 1977 and 1990 authorizing the government to monitor and limit emissions of harmful chemicals into the atmosphere. Although maybe not. Bureaucratic action in 2003, the EPA announced that the Clean Air Act does not give it the authority to regulate CO2 emissions and other greenhouse gases. Actually, yes. Judicial action in 2007 in response to a case brought by 12 states, the Supreme Court rules that greenhouse gases are covered by the Clean Air Act. A second try. In March of 2013, the EPA issues a draft of a new regulation that would limit CO2 emissions from new power plants. Obama weighs in. Presidential directive in June of 2013. President Obama directs the EPA to develop additional regulations for limiting CO2 emissions from new and existing power plants. The results? In September 2013, the EPA modifies its draft regulations to place CO2 standards on new power plants and issues a revised proposal. In June of 2014, the EPA proposes an additional rule that aims to cut CO2 emissions from existing power plants. And guess what? President Trump is undoing all of this. Feedback. March 2014, supporters and opponents of the new rules submit over 6 million comments. third try. New regulations finalized in August of 2015. The EPA announces its Clean Power Plan, which will regulate the CO2 emissions from both new and existing power plants. February 2016, the Supreme Court puts implementation of the Clean Power Plan for existing plants on hold.